In the spring of 1971, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Uraqua, Wisconsin, a 31-year-old woman named Lorine Deweiler paid $45 for 212 Pekin ducks that nobody else in Vernon County wanted. The auctioneer had spent the better part of 10 minutes trying to work up interest. He listed them the way a man lists something he's embarrassed to have on the sheet. 212 Pekin ducks, he said, housed in a low structure at the back of the Halverson property in varying states of health, requiring immediate relocation as the bank had already scheduled demolition of the outbuildings for the following Thursday. He mentioned they were pecans, as though that was the best thing he could say about them. And then he mentioned the pond, which was a drainage ditch that had backed up behind the barn over the course of about 15 years, and which the county had twice attempted to tile and twice given up on. And he said the ducks came with whatever standing water they'd been living in, as though the water were a liability he was disclosing before someone could sue him later. The opening bid was $20. A man from La Crosse bid $20 and then looked at the pen and dropped out. Lorine Deweiler bid $45 and nobody moved. Her brother-in-law Gerald was standing next to her. He said, "Lorine, what in the world are you going to do with 200 ducks?" It was not entirely a question. She said, "I'm going to put them to work." Gerald told that story at the Viroqua Feed and Grain the following Monday. And by Wednesday, it had reached the quick trip on the edge of town. And by the following Sunday, it had made the rounds of the parking lot outside of First Lutheran. And in every version of the story, the punchline was the same. Lorine Deweiler had paid $45 for $200 ducks and a pond the county couldn't drain, and she was going to put them to work. They laughed for about 3 years. They stopped laughing when the bottom field started producing. Let me tell you about Lorine Deweiler, because what she did with those ducks in that 30-acre bottom only makes sense if you understand who she was and where that kind of thinking came from. Lorine was born in 1940 on a 280-acre farm in the western hill country of Vernon County, the second of 4 children and the only one who stayed. Her father, August Deweiler, was the kind of man who had learned to fix everything because he had no choice and had then discovered that he preferred it that way. He ran a mixed operation, dairy, corn, oats, and about 60 acres of steep pasture that he rented to a neighbor's beef cattle. And he maintained every piece of equipment on the place himself, with a shop he'd built in 1938, from lumber he'd milled off his own ridge. The shop had a concrete floor he'd poured in 3 sections over 3 summers, a wood stove made from a 55-gallon drum, and a workbench along the east wall that he'd built from 2-in-oak planks. The same bench his own father had used in a different building on a different farm, before August had disassembled it and hauled it here board by board in the back of a borrowed truck. August Deweiler believed in 2 things above almost everything else. He believed that a man who understood his land had an advantage over a man who merely owned it. And he believed that debt was the most expensive thing you could put on a farm, more expensive than any piece of equipment, because debt had a payment due whether the corn came in or it didn't, whether the milk check covered it or it didn't, whether the weather cooperated or it turned on you in July and left you with half a crop and a full payment schedule. He said this to his children regularly and without drama, the way a man states a fact he considers settled. What August Deweiler did not teach his children from a textbook, he taught them from the land itself. He walked his fields the way other men read newspapers. He knew which corners drained and which held water. He knew that the 30-acre bottom on the south end of the property, a low, flat stretch that sat between 2 ridges and collected runoff from about 400 acres of surrounding hillside, was the most complicated piece of ground he owned. In wet years, it flooded. In dry years, it produced better corn than the upland fields because the moisture stayed. In average years, it was unpredictable in ways that made it difficult to plan around. The county had looked at it twice and recommended tile drainage. August had looked at the county's proposals and looked at his checkbook and looked at the field and decided that the field was telling him something the county wasn't listening to. He never tiled it. He farmed around it. He watched it. Lorine watched it with him. Her brothers left Vernon County in the 1960s, one to Milwaukee and one to a job with the railroad out of La Crosse. Her sister married a man from Richland Center and moved across the ridge. Lorine had a suitcase packed in the fall of 1961. She had a job offer from a department store in Madison, a place to stay with a cousin, and a bus ticket she'd bought and held for 6 weeks before she put it in the drawer of her nightstand and didn't take it out again. Her father's health had started turning that summer, and she told herself she'd go in the spring. Spring came and she was needed and she stayed, and then staying became the shape of her life. August Deweiler died in March of 1967. He left Lorine the farm, paid for 280 acres with no mortgage and no liens. He left her the shop, the tools, and a savings account at the Viroqua State Bank with $4,200 in it. He left her a set of notebooks, one for each decade he'd farmed the place, in which he had recorded rainfall yields, soil observations, and a running commentary on what the land was doing and why. The notebooks on the bottom field alone ran to 40 pages. Lorine was 26 years old. She was the sole owner of a paid-for farm with no debt, a working shop, and more written information about her own ground than most agronomists had, about land they'd studied professionally. She read every notebook twice before planting season. Not because she was sentimental about her father's handwriting, though she was, because the notebooks told her things the land wasn't saying loudly enough for a casual observer to hear. Now the 30-acre bottom. When Lorine Deweiler looked at that low, wet field, she didn't see what everyone else saw. What everyone else saw was a problem, a drainage problem specifically, the kind that cost money to fix and produced unreliable results and made bankers nervous and neighbors sympathetic. The county's tile proposals had been real proposals with real engineering behind them, and the estimates had run between $4,000 and $6. Zero zone for a system that August notebook suggested might not even solve the problem, because the water wasn't just running in from the ridges, it was coming up. The bottom had a high water table that fluctuated with the season, and tiling the surface drainage would help in wet springs but wouldn't touch the underlying hydrology. Her father had figured this out by 1955. He'd written it down in the third notebook in his careful slanted hand. The bottom wants to be wet. The question is whether wet can be made useful. Lorine had been thinking about that sentence for 4 years when she drove to the Halverson liquidation sale in the spring of 1971. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. A widow woman at an auction buying something ridiculous for $45. The ways a person buys a bad decision on a Saturday morning when they're not thinking clearly. They were actually watching the final step in a plan she'd been building since 1967. The ducks weren't the idea. The ducks were the answer to an idea she'd already worked out on paper. Let me tell you what Lorine already knew before she ever bid. She had spent the winter of 1969 to 1970 reading everything she could find on waterfowl integration and agricultural systems. This was not easy reading to find in Vernon County in 1969. She wrote letters to the University of Wisconsin Extension Office in Madison. She wrote to a poultry researcher at Iowa State, whose name she'd found in a farm journal. She drove to the La Crosse Public Library twice and spent full days in the periodical room. What she assembled over the course of about 18 months was a working understanding of what a managed flock of Pekin ducks could do to a wet, low-lying field over a period of years. Ducks eat aquatic vegetation. They eat the roots, not just the surface growth, which means they suppress wetland plants at the source, rather than just trimming the tops. They eat insects and grubs and snails, and the larvae of the mosquitoes that made the bottom field unpleasant to work in summer. Their manure deposited directly into the water and onto the wet soil is high in nitrogen and phosphorus and breaks down in ways that build organic matter rather than compacting it. A managed flock rotated correctly doesn't overjig graze. It cultivates, it opens the soil structure, it deposits fertility, it converts standing water from a liability into a production input, and Pekin ducks specifically were the right breed for this. They were heavy enough to work the soil without being so heavy they compacted it. They were cold hardy enough for Wisconsin winters if they had shelter. They were calm enough to manage without elaborate infrastructure. They produced eggs and meat as a secondary income stream while they worked, and they were in the spring of 1971, available in quantity at a farm liquidation sale outside of Viroqua for $45 for 212 of them. She had built the shelter the previous fall. That's the part nobody knew. In September of 1970, 6 months before the Halverson sale, Lorine had spent 3 weekends building a low open-sided structure at the north edge of the bottom field, using lumber from a collapsed corn crib she'd taken down herself, and tin roofing she'd bought secondhand from a man in Westby for $11. The structure was 60 feet long and 12 feet deep, open on the south face, set on pressure-treated posts her father had stockpiled in the shop. She'd strung a single strand of electric fence around a 2-acre section of the bottom to serve as a starter paddock. She dug a gravity-fed water line from the spring on the hillside above using pipe she'd bought in August at the co-op in Viroqua, $40 worth of one in galvanized. She had done all of this before she bid on a single duck. The shelter $11, the roofing labor her own, the pipe and fittings $40, the fence wire and posts $22, the posts for the shelter from her father's stockpile nothing, the ducks $45, total infrastructure and acquisition cost for the project that Vernon County had spent 3 years laughing about, $118. She brought the ducks home in the bed of her truck in wooden crates she'd borrowed from a neighbor. 2 trips on a Saturday in April, and she put them in the starter paddock and watched them for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, they had found the water. By the following morning, they were working it. Let me tell you about what happened over the next several years, because this is where the story stops being about ducks and starts being about something else entirely. The first summer was observation. Lorine kept the flock in the 2-acre starter paddock and watched what they did to it. She recorded what her father would have recorded: water clarity, plant cover, soil surface condition, insect pressure in a notebook she'd bought specifically for the project. By midsummer, the starter paddock had changed visibly. The cattails and reed canary grass that had dominated the wet margin were thinned. The water was clearer. The soil at the water's edge, where the ducks worked it daily, had a different texture, looser, darker, richer smelling. The mosquito population in that corner of the field was noticeably lower than in the sections the ducks hadn't reached. She expanded the paddock in the second year, adding another 3 acres of the bottom to the rotation. She moved the flock in sections, letting one area rest while another was worked, the way a good grazier rotates cattle. The rested section showed recovery and then improvement. The vegetation that came back was different from what had been there before. Less reed canary grass, more clover and mixed forbs that the ducks had seeded inadvertently by moving through. By the 3rd year, she was selling eggs. Not many. Pecans are meat ducks primarily, and their laying rate is moderate, but enough to cover the feed bill through the summer months when the ducks were foraging heavily on their own. She sold them at the farm and through the Viroqua Food Co-op, which had opened in 1970, and which had customers who would pay 25 cents more per dozen for eggs from a farm they could visit. She sold excess drakes each fall as meat birds, processed them herself in the shop where her father had hung deer, and sold them to the same customers who bought the eggs. The ducks were paying for themselves. That was not the plan. The plan was the field. In the 5th year, 1976, Lorine planted the first section of the bottom field that the ducks had finished working. She planted it to oats and red clover, a nurse crop combination her father had used on ground he was bringing back from poor condition. The oats came in thin. The soil was still adjusting, but the clover establishment was exceptional. She noted it in the notebook. Clover stand better than upland fields. Nitrogen from duck manure measurable in tissue test. Organic matter up from 1% to 8% in 5 years. She showed the tissue test results to no one. She wrote them in the notebook and kept working. If you have ever watched a community dismiss something it didn't understand and then watch the thing prove itself anyway quietly in a field where nobody was paying attention, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because this one is just getting started. By 1978, Lorine Deweiler was farming 12 acres of the bottom field that had been unplantable when she'd inherited the farm. Not all 12 acres were in row crops. She was rotating sections through a corn, oat, and clover sequence that kept the soil building rather than depleting. But 12 acres of ground that had previously produced nothing but mosquitoes and county engineering proposals was now producing a crop every year. She was running the ducks on the remaining 18 acres of the bottom, plus a rotating section of the worked ground after harvest, letting them glean and fertilize and continue the process they'd started in 1971. Her corn yields on the bottom ground by 1979 were running 8 to 12 bushels per acre higher than her upland corn. She had the records to prove it. She kept the records in the same notebooks her father had started, the same format, the same careful notation of inputs and outputs and observations. The bottom field, which August Deweiler had written about for 40 pages without finding a solution, had become the most productive ground on the farm. She had done it for $118 in infrastructure and $45 for the flock, $163 total. The county's tile drainage proposal, the one that would not have solved the underlying hydrology, had been estimated at between $4 and $6, zero in 1968 money. You know what happened in the early 1980s. You know it if you grew up in farm country, or if you've read about it, or if you knew anyone who lost a farm in those years. Interest rates climbed to 18% and held there. Corn prices fell below $2 a bushel in some markets. Land values that had run up through the 1970s on borrowed optimism came down hard and fast, and the loans that had been written against those inflated values didn't come down with them. The banks called notes. The FMA restructured what it could and foreclosed on what it couldn't. In Vernon County, Wisconsin, between 1981 and 1986, 14 farms went to auction, not equipment sales, full liquidations, land, buildings, machinery, everything. Lorine Deweiler watched this happen from a farm with no debt. Her expenses in 1982 were feed, seed, fuel, and parts. They didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut because there had never been anything borrowed to cut. She did not have a machinery note. She did not have a land loan. She had the same paid for 280 acres her father had left her, plus the 12 working acres of bottom ground she had created herself, plus a savings account at the Viroqua State Bank that had grown from her father's $4.200 to something considerably larger over 15 years of a low-cost operation and careful accumulation. She watched her neighbors with quiet sadness, not satisfaction. She had known these people her whole life, had gone to school with their children, had bought hay from them in dry years, and sold the moats in good ones. When Dale Ruzinski lost his 160 acres on the ridge above her north field in the spring of 1983, she did not feel vindicated. She felt the weight of it. Dale was not a bad farmer. He had borrowed against his land in 1977 to buy a tractor he needed and a grain bin that made sense at the time. And the math that had looked reasonable at 8% had become impossible at 17%, and the corn price that was supposed to service the debt had gone in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. It was not stupidity. It was the arithmetic of borrowed time running out. She bought his 40 acres that bordered her east fence line at the county auction in October of 1983. The opening bid was $400 an acre. She bid against one other party, a land investment company out of Madison that was acquiring distressed agricultural ground throughout the region, and she bid them up to $480 an acre, and they dropped out. 40 acres at $480, $19. $200 paid in a check drawn on the Viroqua State Bank, written in the auction barn in front of about 60 people who had come to watch the Rinsky land sell. The room went quiet when she wrote that check. Not politely quiet and quiet the way a room goes quiet when something happens that requires everyone present to rearrange what they thought they understood. Gerald, her brother-in-law, was there. He had been at the Halverson sale 12 years earlier. He had told the story about the ducks at the feed store. He stood at the back of the auction barn in October of 1983 and watched Lorine Deweiler write a check for $19. $200 without hesitation, without a loan officer beside her, without paperwork to sign later. And he didn't say anything for a long time. He found her in the parking lot afterward. He said, "I owe you an apology about those ducks." She said, "The ducks worked out fine, Gerald." He said he knew that now. She said she'd known it in 1971, and she didn't say it unkindly, just plainly, the way her father had stated facts he considered settled. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that August Deweiler would have understood without a word of explanation. Lorine farmed the expanded operation, 320 acres now, including the Ruzinski ground, through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s. She bought one more parcel in 1988, 22 acres of bottomland adjacent to her south fence, at a price that reflected what distressed land was still bringing in Vernon County that summer. She paid cash. She continued running ducks on a rotating section of the low ground, a reduced flock by then, 40 birds instead of 200 because the bottom field was mostly reclaimed and needed maintenance rather than transformation. The ducks had done what she'd asked them to do. She kept them because they kept the ground honest. Her niece Patricia, her brother Harold's youngest daughter, came to work the farm in 1991 at the age of 17, driving up from La Crosse on weekends during high school and full-time after graduation. Lorine started teaching her the way August had taught Lorine, by walking the fields, by reading the notebooks, by explaining what the land was doing and why. She taught her the duck rotation. She taught her the notebook system. She showed her the tissue test records from 1976, the ones that showed the organic matter climbing from 1 to 8% in 5 years of duck management, and she explained what that number meant in terms of water retention and fertilizer efficiency and long-term soil health. Patricia was 22 years old when she first understood the full arc of what her aunt had done. She said, "You built a drainage system out of ducks." Lorine thought about that for a moment. She said, "I built a fertility system out of a drainage problem. That's a little different." Patricia has farmed the place since 2003. The bottom field is fully integrated into the rotation now. Corn, soybeans, oats, and clover in a 4-year sequence with a small maintained flock still working the wet margin at the south end, where the water table still rises in April. The organic matter in the bottom field soil tests at 1%. The upland fields average 2. The ground that the county couldn't drain is the best ground on the farm. August Deweiler's notebooks are in a filing cabinet in the shop. Patricia has added 4 of her own. The workbench along the east wall is the same one August built from his father's oak planks, hauled here, board by board in a borrowed truck. The wood stove still works. The shop still smells like cutting oil and cold concrete in the morning. In the spring of 2004, the Vernon County Agricultural Extension Office invited Lorine to speak at a soil health conference in Viroqua. She was 64 years old. The room had farmers in it, extension agents, a soil scientist from the university, and a few people from the NRCS office who worked on wetland conservation programs. She spoke for about 12 minutes. She did not use notes. She said that the 30-acre bottom on her farm had been classified as a drainage problem for the entire history of her family's ownership of the land. She said the county had proposed tiling it twice and estimated the cost at between $4,000 and $6,000 in 1968, which she calculated at somewhere between $30,000 and $45,000 in present value. She said she had solved the problem for $163 in 1971 money, which she did not bother to adjust for inflation, because the point was clear enough without the arithmetic. She said the solution had also produced eggs, meat, and nitrogen fertility as secondary outputs while it was working. She said the field it had reclaimed was now the most productive ground on the farm by every measurable metric. She said a drainage problem is a description of what you see. A fertility opportunity is a description of what's possible. The difference between those two descriptions is not engineering, it's attention. The soil scientist from the university asked her afterward if she had published any of her records. She said no. He asked if he could look at the notebooks. She said she'd think about it. She thought about it for 2 years and then sent Patricia to Madison with photocopies of the relevant pages. The data from the Det Tweer bottom field appears in a 2007 extension bulletin on integrated waterfowl management in marginal agricultural land. Lorine Deweiler is cited as a cooperating producer. The bulletin does not mention the $45 or the laughter at First Lutheran or Gerald's apology in the parking lot of the auction barn. Those details are not the kind of thing extension bulletins record, but they are the kind of thing that matters. What do you see when you look at a 30-acre bottom field that floods in spring and holds water through June and costs money every year in lost production and county engineering proposals? Most people see a problem to be solved with money and tile and a contractor with a ditch witch. Lorine Deweiler saw a system that was already doing something, and she asked what it would take to redirect what it was already doing towards something useful. The county spent 30 years trying to drain that field. She spent $45 to make it the best ground she owned. That is the difference between someone who fights the land and someone who listens to it. $163. a low structure built from salvaged lumber. A flock nobody wanted in a field nobody believed in. The 30-acre bottom that Vernon County couldn't drain, transformed by the woman Vernon County couldn't stop underestimating until the evidence was written in the soil itself and there was nothing left to say.